Hello, everyone, and welcome to Quantum Miracles Mastery. I'm your host, Melissa Binkley. I'm a spiritual advisor, entrepreneur, and founder of the Intuitive Intelligence Academy. I love debunking belief systems that have us all trapped and exploring paradigms that disrupt. I believe in magic and miracles and believe together we can create a conscious revolution. On today's episode of Quantum Miracles Mastery, we're going to be talking about the modern resurrection of ancient magic with Dean Radin. Dean Radin, Ph.D., is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, distinguished professor of integral and transpersonal psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and a science advisor for several startup companies. For over 3 decades, he has been engaged in research on the frontiers of consciousness. Before joining the research staff at IONS in 2001, he held appointments at Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International, formerly known as Stanford University Research Institute. He is the co-author of over 250 scientific, technical, and popular articles, 4 dozen book chapters, 2 technical books, and 4 popular books, including the Scientific and Medical Network's 1997 book award, The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, the 2014 Silver Nautilus Book Award, Supernormal, and Real Magic. These books have been translated into Spanish, French, German, all sorts of languages. And he has 100 plus academic articles that appear in peer-reviewed scientific journals, ranging from Foundations of Physics and Physics Essays to Psychological Bulletins, Psychology of Consciousness, and Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. He's been featured in New York Times Magazine articles, and he has done interviews and talks that have included presentations at places like Harvard and Princeton and Columbia and Cambridge. And in 2017, he was named one of the 100 most inspiring people in the world by German magazine Welcome, Dean.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So excited to have you. So when you just start asking you what I ask everybody is, what is your definition of a miracle?
Well, a miracle is similar to the idea of a marvel. The difference is that a marvel is considered to be something that's extraordinary but occurred as a result of natural processes, whereas a miracle is something extraordinary that is assumed to occur by divine processes. So I usually do not use the word miracle. As a scientist, I basically study the natural world. And if there's something beyond the natural world, I'm willing to accept that, but it's not something that science can study.
Very fascinating. And we're going to dive into talking today about magic and the idea behind that. And in my mind, and one of the reasons why I was so keen and excited to have you on here is that what I defined as a miracle in my life is really what you write about as magic. And so I find it super fascinating and that's why I say I believe in magic and miracles. And I thought this was a perfect fit because I think there's this intersection going on right now of the science and the spirituality. And you have a very unique view and one that I completely believe in from having studied neuroscience and quantum physics and the things that I've studied and seeing those 2 things together. I would love to talk a little bit about your career, which seems to be an unexpected miracle for you, and how you came about being in science and getting into the world of consciousness and the study of the paranormal and the different things, because that's not normally the path that most people take.
That's true, although one of the characteristics of becoming a scientist, a predictor of whether somebody will become a scientist, is that they're just curious about everything. Mm-hmm. And I've always been curious about everything. I was one of those annoying kids that kept asking why all the time. And so in looking at a very broad range of topics, even starting in junior high school, I read many of the books in the local library and then kept reading everything because I want to know everything. So the most curious thing that I ran across as a result of looking at the natural sciences and basically every other thing that we could look at was that we don't really understand the nature of consciousness very well. In fact, it's only through consciousness that we know anything. That's the source of everything that we know, almost by definition. And yet it's the most intimate thing that we know and the least understood from a scientific perspective. So I thought, well, that's pretty strange. And as a result, I started reading the literature on parapsychology, which is really the only discipline that looks at the intersection between mind and matter.
Mm.
And somewhere in between there is where consciousness seems to play an important role. And as a result, I became convinced from the literature that there was something going on. And that literature obviously overlaps a lot of religious lore and a lot of mysticism and a lot of stories about magic. And after reading the literature, I started to do experiments. This was in graduate school by this time. And I convinced myself through the experimental results that what I'd been reading about in terms of psychic phenomena was real, which from a scientific perspective is shocking. From a popular perspective, it's not shocking at all. Most people believe in these phenomena because they experience them. But from a scientific perspective, it is so far away from the scientific worldview that I just found it the most curious thing that you could possibly study as a scientist. And that's why I decided to try to pursue that as a career. And it is absolutely true that of the roughly 6 million academics in the world, there are about 40 who are known for having an interest in this topic. And so that's crazy, right?
That
The
is
majority of the population in the world is interested,
40,
but
that's not
only
even
40.
that's like this tiny of a percentage. It's
Yeah, it's
nothing.
1/1000th of 1%.
Wow. I and do you feel like you get a backlash, or that do people like not look at you as you know, as serious scientists because of this? Or you know, I've read some of the things that you wrote, and I feel like now I think that we're growing into a space where science is starting to prove some things, you know, like you're showing the proof behind it, but isn't there a lot of people that don't want to hear that?
Yes, if you're a conventional scientist and go through traditional training, as I did, the only thing you will ever hear about psychic phenomena is that they don't exist, or that there is some evidence for it, but it's not any good. And so when you look at textbooks, the usual place you see it is in an introductory psychology textbook. Sometimes there'll be like a paragraph or 2 paragraphs that says a lot of people believe these things, but there's no evidence for it. And I know that that's not correct.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is annoying that there's a prejudice in science, as there is in any area that you wish to look at. And I completely understand then why the majority of, no, I'm going to take it back. The majority of academics actually have the same experiences as everybody else, right? Scientists are humans and scholars are humans. So we have these same experiences, but we learn very quickly in certain contexts that you don't talk about it.
Mm.
So on the academic side, most people are completely aware that these things exist, but you're not allowed to talk about it. And the same thing happens even in the general public. So if you have a child who is naturally very psychic, they will learn very quickly by the reaction of their friends that they shouldn't talk about these things because they're called weird.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
just from a societal perspective, it is very difficult in any context to talk openly about these phenomena or these experiences, except in some highly constrained contexts like the courses that you teach, right? So then
Right.
it's okay for people to talk about it, and oftentimes they feel amazingly freed. They feel a certain sense of freedom because they're able to express what they have felt, but were never able to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in this time that we're shifting into right now, we're in the midst of a conscious revolution. We've gone through the age of information and the age of technology, and you know, we've had these golden ages and different things that we talked about before. And now I believe that we're in this age of consciousness, and that there's going to be, you know, that there's this revolution that's quietly bringing science and spirituality together so that we can connect the dots on a deeper level. What do you foresee in the future for our world, and what's happening from what you've noticed both scientifically and as you've been studying magic?
Well, magic is pushing it even farther than just consciousness. And we'll go into that a little bit later. But in terms of change in how the world views the importance of studying consciousness, you're completely right. If you look 30 years ago, the idea in medicine that the mind and body were deeply connected, that was laughable. It was called psychosomatic, if called anything, and nobody was studying it. Well, today in medical schools around the US at least, and probably the rest of the world, the idea of the mind and the body being deeply related to each other and concepts like spirituality being very important in terms of medical outcomes, this is now being taught. So that it's no longer laughable, it's part of the curriculum. In addition, if you look at conferences around the world, there are now, well, of course, right now we're talking in the middle of a pandemic, but
Yeah.
Under normal circumstances, there are many, many conferences that are focused on the idea of consciousness from every perspective you can think of, all the way from neuroscience to physics and everything in between. So it has definitely become something that can be talked about. And I think we're beginning to move beyond a brain-centric way of thinking about consciousness, which is the conventional way, as a result of an increasing amount of research on meditation and also on psychedelics.
Yeah.
So in the 1960s, both of those were quite popular. There were government crackdowns everywhere in the world that basically made it impossible to do research in these areas. But now it's lightening up, and we're finding that not only will meditation be successful or be useful in a medical sense, psychological and physical health, but if you start looking at the traditional ideas about meditation and what it was for, it wasn't about stress relief, and it wasn't like it wasn't an adjunct to yoga. It was the primary purpose was to become enlightened.
Yeah.
Of course, when we hear somebody talk about enlightenment today, most people don't even know what that means. But that was the original purpose of meditation, and that is slowly starting to be seen and talked about even within the academic world. The same is true with psychedelics. So every psychedelic researcher who I know, most of whom are in medical schools, they say privately that most of the people taking the psychedelics under the controlled conditions will either report mystical experiences or psychic experiences.
Absolutely.
They don't talk about that because you still can't talk about such things, but they know that it happens all the time. So I think eventually between meditation and psychedelic research and other areas now, including a domain called consciousness hacking, which is the application of technology to try to enhance our awareness, that psychic phenomena will become less and less difficult to talk about. But it will also be talked about without using terms like psychic, because there's too much baggage associated with these terms.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, I've never really thought about that. But I love the conversation about the psychedelics because I believe there's an underground world of people that have been using psychedelics for a really long time for access to consciousness, whether it's LSD or ayahuasca or mushrooms. I have in my own experiences, I've had even MDMA, have had and taken clients through like shamanic experiences and deep knowings and seeing for myself the effects of using these different types of opening drugs to help people to access a consciousness that they maybe can't. Now I just teach meditation practices that actually produce DMT in the brain so that they don't have to use the psychedelics, and so we can kind of step away from that, legally in that. But I think that there's a really powerful movement towards the opening. I mean, mushrooms are now legal in Colorado. Weeds become legal, across most of the U.S., and we're starting to see a shift in those types of ways. Before we dive into the real magic, I think that I'd love to get your definition of spirituality. Because I think as a scientist and like looking at where we're going to go into talking about, the spirituality and the connection between these things, but this magic that I'd just love to know what your definition of that is.
I view spirituality as a set of experiences that involve transcendence. So transcendence then is talking about experiences that don't seem to be bound within the ordinary ways of thinking about space and time. So that means perceiving beyond the reach of the ordinary senses, being able to influence the world through your intention. All of those are related to the notion of transcendence. And I think that is what people mostly are talking about in terms of spiritual. Because if they don't immediately connect the spiritual with notions of the divine, right? So somebody can be spiritual without being religious. Well, that means that maybe you believe in one or more gods, but not necessarily. You believe that there is simply a larger way or more intimate way of interacting with the universe that is not somehow locked inside your head. It's bigger than that in some way.
Beautiful. Thank you. So let's dive into your latest book. It's entitled Real Magic. I recently read this book, and I felt such a deep connection to it. So I can't wait to talk about it. But what do you mean by magic?
So magic in general, I'm talking about magic, M-A-G-I-C, actually with a K, which is the metaphysical form of magic as opposed to stage magic. Mm-hmm. So the way I describe it is I'm not talking about Harry Potter magic, which is fiction, and I'm not talking about Harry Houdini, which is illusory magic, stage magic. I'm talking about the real stuff on which Harry Potter and Harry Houdini are based. So this kind of magic, it's kind of a term that is saying we don't exactly know how it works, but we know that it works. Magic traditionally is three categories. It's divination, which is perceiving through space and time. It's something I call force of will, which is simply the application of your intention to make something manifest in the physical world. And then the third category is called theurgy, which comes from Greek words having to do with God work. And what it means is that you interact with spirits and get them to do things on your behalf. So those are the practices. Yeah. Notice these are practices that are based on esoteric theories, but as a practice, they're completely pragmatic. It's something that works or doesn't work.
Right, absolutely. And this is why I'm so fascinated by this, because what you call magic, the first two that you talk about are things that we actually teach in our academy. That when we talk about miracles and quantum and the quantum miracles is teaching people how to, force of will, how to manifest things by force of will, and and being able to do that. And then I love the idea behind the third piece, which is the theology. So I'd love to dive deeper into this idea of magic and talk a little bit about the book that you've written, and because you're bringing science to magic. You're actually that's what what's so incredible about all this is you're taking the scientific view and saying, hey, like, I'm a scientist and I'm telling you that magic is real. So how do we know that real magic is real?
Well, so if you consider magic as divination, force of will, and theurgy, the nice thing about casting it in those terms is that in all three classes, there have been over a century of scientific experiments looking at those kinds of phenomena. So if we call divination, say, precognition or clairvoyance, there are thousands of studies looking at both of those kinds of phenomena. And it's very clear when you look at the meta-analysis, which is the integration of lots of experiments looking at the same thing, the precognition exists and clairvoyance exists. So therefore, what people talk about in traditional magical terms as divination, that also exists. The same is true then of force of will. So in that case, we talk about it in terms of mind-matter interaction or psychokinetic effects. And we see effects that are real there as well. And theurgy is primarily looked at in an experimental sense as mediumship. So mediums claim that they're talking to deceased loved ones, sometimes also to spirits, or the spirit and a deceased loved one may be the same thing, we don't know. But we can show that mediums can get verifiable information from their clients, even under double or triple blind. So there's no bias involved. So if you take the scientific perspective, in this case, it's about parapsychology, the discipline that studies these things. you can say, well, at least the magical practices that are traditionally talked about, they are real. What the difficulty at this point, though, is that people will then imagine that any kind of magical practice is much, much bigger and more robust and more reliable than what we can see in the laboratory. So in the laboratory is an artificial environment. We're asking somebody to do something psychic on demand under conditions that we define. That's why we have high confidence that they're real if we see it. But the effects that we see generally are pretty small, because we're saying, give me something psychic now, make a miracle happen right now under conditions that I want. In the real world, when something happens in a more spontaneous way, with a lot more motivation, like there's an underlying reason why somebody wants this thing to happen, you generally will end up with much bigger effects. But they're very difficult to capture in the laboratory. So we know that they're real. What we see in the lab is pretty small, but it's real. In the real world, it's likely to be much bigger.
Yeah, I never really thought about that, but now that you say that, that makes a lot of sense, because you're formulating or trying to create something that is not just happening almost naturally. I've been traveling the world for the last 3 years doing these conferences and these events, and I've been recording miracles. And so I call it the world's largest miracles experiment. Obviously, it's not a scientific experiment in the way that there's not the double blinds and, all the different types of things. But I mean, I've literally been teaching techniques to have people create miracles in their lives. Like I've seen instantaneous healings and standing right in front of me on my stage. I've had people have, I had a woman that came to one of my events who, silly stuff like her freezer, the ice machine on her freezer had been broken for 1.5 years. And all of a sudden, she asked for a blessing or something, to happen just so we could start playing with the field. And she comes back and she says, my ice machine on my freezer is no longer broken. It's been working and it hasn't stopped since then. Like, things like this where you get to play with this kind of stuff. But it's the experiment inside the world and not in a laboratory. So you get to, the belief behind it. I think you get to see that a lot more than when you're having to scientifically prove it.
Yeah, and I hear stories like this all the time. From a scientific perspective, the stories are amazing, but they're considered anecdotes.
Yeah,
right? It
exactly.
doesn't count. It's not the currency of proof within science.
Of course, yeah.
But given that what we see in the lab is we have high confidence that these things do exist, it's not surprising to me at all that occasionally in the real world, if somebody will report something really big or something that doesn't need statistics to evaluate it, and it's probably made out of the same stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to go back and talk about divination, because I don't know if everybody on here that's watching, with the big reach that we have, knows all what that is. And I'd love to talk a little bit about divination and the precognition, because I know that this was something that even the military used. And I think it's a really powerful thing to explain so that people can understand more about what this magic is.
Well, divination traditionally is associated with crystal balls, with mirror gazing, with throwing the runes, with the I Ching, lots of methods like that. And in most cases about prediction. It's divining the future. But divination also is about seeing at a distance. It's seeing what is happening either for somebody personally or just something at a distance. So in traditional terms, we're talking about clairvoyance. Clairvoyance is perception through space and time. The perception through time part is called precognition, sometimes also called presentiment, sometimes premonitions, sometimes forecasting, lots of words for it, but it's all the same thing, perceiving through space and time. So you mentioned about the military use of it. It was for espionage, for intelligence purposes. The euphemism was called remote viewing, but remote viewing is clairvoyance. That's exactly what it is. The only difference then that evolved out of the military program is that they couldn't just go find people and ask them to start doing this, because most of it was classified work. So they recruited people from the Army. So they had to figure out, how do we take people who at least are sympathetic or open to the idea of being able to do clairvoyance? How do we choose among a very large pool of potential people and train them to get better. And so methods of training were developed. Sometimes controlled remote viewing, CRV, is one of the ways that have been taught. And so since that program stopped in 1995, from then, many of the former Army remote viewers have gone into training. So there are now thousands of people who have been trained in various flavors of methods for teaching clairvoyance. Some of them are talented and are quite good. Some are not so talented, in which case they might get a little bit of skill, but not significantly good.
That's really incredible. And I think that it's a super powerful way to look at that this is something that can be taught, right? Like this is not just something that you're born with, a gift, because most people think that having any of the clairs, because there's clairvoyance and clairsentience, that these are all like, well, this is a gift and not everybody can do it. But this is kind of proving that these are our techniques and things that we have available to us that you can actually train in.
Yes and no.
Yes. Okay, great. Okay.
So the yes is that there are definitely people who have natural talent. Sometimes they know they have the talent. They may even call it psychic. Oops.
It's okay.
Do we lose our connection, or? Oh, you're on mute now.
Okay.
Okay. So is there natural talent? Yes. Some people are very naturally talented. And the best metaphor I can think of is if you want to play tennis. So any normal person who has the ability to control their movements can learn to play tennis. They'll learn the rules, they learn the movements, and so on. Not everybody is going to end up in Wimbledon. Well, what's the difference? The difference is natural talent. And it's exactly the same in this domain. That some people will have natural talent and very quickly be able to learn and get to a very high plateau. Somebody else who can go through the motions and learn to meditate a little and learn to do the various tasks, they can learn above zero. I mean, they will learn something, but their talent is such that it's not going to allow them to get to these very refined states.
That makes a lot of sense. I've not thought of it in that way, but when you put it out in that way, that we all have certain talents, right? Like the things that we love. I have certain things that I'm able to see and know and do. And as I've honed my skills, I've gotten a lot better and a lot better. And I would have to say, because of the work that I've been doing in this world, that I have a different gift than, and I can teach people, but they may not be able to access as much as I can at certain times. So that's a good way to think about it. When you think about sports, and it's a good way, because I'm definitely not an Olympic athlete, and there's only a certain echelon of people that will really make that experience happen in their lives.
Right.
What are the consequences of recognizing the reality of magic?
It depends on what your profession is and what your predilections are. So people who tend to go into science are usually very left-brained, to put it in those terms, that they're highly analytical, very detail-oriented, and like to get into the details of any topic. And they could spend a lot of time in those domains. For somebody who spends an enormous amount of time in analytical work, they may not be able to access the kinds of experiences that we're talking about, at least not very easily. Mm. For people who are involved in the arts or in creative enterprises like fine art or writing or dance, theater, they find it much more easy to get into these domains because those domains tend not to be so analytical. They tend to be more involved with emotion and the feeling and so on. And there's that distinction seems to be a very easy way of thinking then about who is likely to gravitate towards these kinds of experiences. So the artists will, and the scientists won't. And unfortunately, the currency of truth, at least in the Western world today, tends to be on science. So science as a whole will look at this and say, I don't know if I want to even believe this. On the other hand, there are many scientists who are far more artistic than they are analytical, like myself. I grew up in an artistic family and I played the violin for 20 years. So I come from a little bit of both, in that I'm analytical in terms of the work that I do, but my background is mostly in the arts and music. So I find it very easy to imagine that, well, why couldn't we have these abilities? There's an enormous number of things that science has not studied very well, and a lot of things that don't even fit within the scientific worldview, but clearly are out there. If you come from a family that of all scientists, where everyone is highly analytic, and no one has ever talked about or had any experiences with psychic phenomena, it's completely understandable then why you would say that I don't think I believe this.
Yeah.
Because it would be very similar to, let's say you had never seen somebody play the guitar as a true professional, either classical or like rock guitar. And then so they gave you a guitar and you started playing and said, this is difficult. I don't even like what I'm hearing here. And so if somebody said, well, you could play these amazing things, like we'll play something on a record and you could hear it, and you'd find it almost impossible to believe that somebody had that level of skill.
Yeah.
Until you were brought somewhere and watched them play. And even then you would say, no, it's fake. So if it's not part of your experience, it's very, very difficult to accept how these things can exist.
I had an experience, now that you say that was very much like this. My ex-girlfriend was an engineer who whole family were scientists and engineers. And so then all of a sudden this girl walks into her life, and for a moment she said, I never believed in anything until I met you, because she's like, I felt like I've known you for lifetimes. And she's like, but this isn't even part of my world or my consciousness. And we were together for about 2.5 years. And in 2.5 years, she stretched to her limit of like, she would see things happen, healings and stuff like that. And she just would be like, she was almost like kind of started meditating, started doing some things, but it was so out of her norm and out of her realm and I just didn't fit into her family view of like what the world saw, that she just couldn't even handle having me around family at times and stuff, because it was just the things that would happen around with me and stuff were just so different from her world. And so I never really thought about that, but it really is. I studied science in college and in my 20s, and was very much on the other side. And it took me years and trying to heal my own traumas and the things that I was doing. I would have never said if I, in my early 20s, would have ever said I was spiritual or that I walked in this world at all. I was definitely on the other side of the board. So I can see how a lot of people never get past that piece of it and kind of get stuck right there.
And it's uncomfortable, right? I mean, it's always uncomfortable to encounter something that you're not sure you want even to allow inside, because if you do, it's going to shatter a portion of your belief structure.
Yeah, right.
So when I was working on the government program, the remote viewing program, we would oftentimes have contract monitors that were sent to SRI at the time. That was the science company doing this kind of research. So we'd have contract monitors from Washington sent to California to look at what those crazy California people were doing. And what they wanted to see is we don't know if we believe in this remote viewing thing, so show it to us. We learned pretty quickly that if you showed them, it didn't have the same impact as if they did it themselves. So at the time, Russell Targ was one of the primary leaders of this thing. His superpower is somehow to get a person to do remote viewing really well. He just is able to do that somehow. So he'd have the contract monitor do a remote viewing, and then they would show them the target, and then they would see the match, and the person would have a meltdown.
Wow.
Because their belief system is shattered about what they think is possible. And one of the things that was learned after a while is that you don't want that person to go back to Washington the next day, because they'll sound like a crazy person. They'll say, hey, everything we know is suddenly wrong, and they'll act crazy for a while. So they have to reintegrate their personality. And so you reintegrate with, you are exactly the same person that you were before. Almost all of your beliefs are still exactly the same. It's just one new element. It's not scary. It just is a slight expansion of what you can now accept. But if you don't allow for that integration, then people can go off the deep end.
Yeah, never really thought about that, but that makes a lot of sense. All right, awesome. This has been such an incredible conversation. I got a couple of more questions for you today. Before we leave, I believe when people are trying to transform their lives and working on bringing more magic and miracles, and that they sometimes believe that it takes a complete overhaul. What is like one ritual, practice, or thing that you cannot live without? Something that you do that that you would love to share with our audience?
Well, now is an unusual time because we're all sitting in our houses most of the time.
Yeah.
So I would say that under normal circumstances where things are a little bit more settled, I would meditate every day. I do it primarily for physical health. It's just a matter of stress reduction. And so my story on this is that I don't travel as much as I used to, especially now. But in the past, I traveled a lot. Long trips, short trips, whatever. And I was always not particularly comfortable in airplanes. So I would take a Valium. I figured out that basically it's about 2 milligrams for every 500 miles. That's how I would plan it. And then I would go through periods where I would be very disciplined in meditation, and other times where I'd sort of give it up for a while. So on the times when I was meditating diligently every day for long periods of time, I would get on a plane and I would forget to take the Valium. I was so different internally in terms of how calm I was that it didn't even occur to me that I would need to take Valium.
Right.
On those times when I wasn't meditating for a while, my level of anxiety rose to the point where it was on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
So it showed very clearly, to me at least, of this contrast of your level of anxiety that you can modulate by whether you meditate or not. So then an easy thing for people to do is if you tend to be anxious, like I do, like me, I'm wired tight, as the neurologist would say, meditation really does help an enormous amount in terms of your mental stress, which of course is reflected in physical stress.
Absolutely. Yeah. I find it super powerful. And there's all types of different types of meditations, right? Like there's a new one that I've been, not new one, but new one to my world, as in Dawson Church is doing the eco meditation right now. And he's talking about it for the, the COVID-19, because it increases the and the immunology in your saliva. Right. There's mantras, there's chanting, there's all different types of ways we can figure out to do meditations. And I love meditating every day. So I think that's a great advice, and especially during our anxious times right now.
Yeah.
So Dean, you're on your deathbed and you have one truth that you could leave for all of your friends, family, and humanity to know. What would you say?
I'm not sure it would be a truth, but it would be more like if the question were, if you imagine what your legacy would be, okay, what would that be?
Yeah.
The legacy that I am attempting to create is to allow the study of exceptional states of consciousness to be conducted in every university in the world.
Oh.
And as I said before, when we first started speaking, that if there are 40 people around the world who are actively engaged in this kind of research, that's insane. That shows that we have a taboo that prevents us from understanding the nature of who we are ultimately. And that is not only insane, it's very dangerous, because if we don't have a very good sense of who and what we are, then maybe we're making bad decisions. We just can look now about lots of countries who knew with 100% certainty that we're going to have a pandemic. And yet very few countries were prepared. I mean, like one of the countries that was completely prepared was Finland. Well, why was Finland prepared? Because they had always been living on the edge of the Cold War, right next to Russia, right next to Europe. And so they had prepared constantly since all throughout the Cold War to prepare for some kind of a major tragedy like this, and they were completely prepared for a pandemic. By contrast, we look at the United States even, where people knew for years, we're talking about what would happen if, knowing that it would happen with 100% certainty, and yet we see the results. Mm-hmm. So this has related into the nature of consciousness. Like who and what are we? What kind of decisions can we make? What are we capable of? Can we use our minds to help treat this particular uh, virus? I think the answers in all cases are probably yes, but we need a lot more research to figure out exactly how to do it and the best way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Great advice. And our last question today. And if you guys, I want you all to know, please look at the link below and go and get Real Magic. It's an amazing and incredible book. I want you to pick it up, read it, and learn more about magic in the world and this incredible experience that we've had. And thank you so much, Dean. If you could do one thing in this world before you pass to the next realm, what would you do?
It's what I'm doing as my profession. It's allowing people to recognize, first of all, that their experiences are real and that they're probably way more meaningful than we're ready to talk about. But I would like people to talk about it.
All right, so that's it. We're going to talk about more magic. Let's get out there and share and shift the consciousness of the world together. Thank you all so very much for joining us for another episode of Quantum Miracles Mastery. If you loved what you heard from Dean, please share this with everyone that you know. Pick up Real Magic and follow what he's doing, and hopefully we'll have some other good stuff come out from him in the future, and we will see some more scientific studies, and the study of magic and miracles will keep going on. Thank you, Dean.
You're welcome.